I'm so excited to
Oh,
welcome
thank you.
back Deborah Kolb. And she is the author of this wonderful book, Negotiating at Work, Turn Small Wins into Big Gains. She is an expert on gender negotiations. And last time we talked pretty much about women in negotiation at work. Today, we are going to talk more about the gender negotiations. And in this era of Me Too, how do we communicate effectively? How do
Right.
we be genuine? And how do we get this done? Let me tell you a little bit about Deborah, and then I'm going to let her tell you a little bit more. I'm really excited because she just got an award in August, and she can tell us about that too.
Yeah.
She showed me her beautiful. She's been in this business a long time and had so many awards, but she just got another one as usual.
Oh, so sweet.
Yeah, so let me just tell you a little bit. Deborah is the professor for women in leadership emeritus and co-founder of the Ford Foundation funded Center for Gender in Negotiation and Organizations at the Simmons University School of Business. Professor Kolb served as executive director of the program on negotiation, which I took many years ago at Harvard Law School, where she currently co-directs the Negotiation in the Workplace project. So this is a great expertise. She's written many books, and she is the ultimate authority on gender issues in negotiation and leadership. And I told you about her new book, which I love and I've been spreading around. And in addition to her research and her writing, she also organizes and leads executive development programs and serves as a consultant to many organizations, and too many to even talk about, including the White House, Dell, Deloitte, Fidelity, and so much more. But tell us about this wonderful awards you recently got.
Oh, well, for years, I've been doing programs for women in leadership. And this was an award from the Academy of Management. Its gender and diversity division, honored me for a scholarship in the field of advancing women in leadership, which was a total surprise to me. Friends of mine nominated me, and people had to write supporting letters, and they were just lovely, made me cry.
Oh gosh, yeah, and you definitely deserve it.
Thank you
And
so much.
for people who've watched the one that we did previously, I just was so excited because I've read Deborah's stuff for years, not only her books, but her writings, and know about her. And it's just such a thrill to actually get to know what a wonderful person she is and have her
Thank you.
on our show and have her do the Zoom interview with us. It's wonderful. So Deborah, tell us how you got into gender negotiation.
Okay. Well, let me just start with how I got into negotiation, because it's sort of a little bit of an interesting story. When I was in graduate school, I did my dissertation on mediation. And I wrote a book. My dissertation was published. It was called The Mediators. And when I then was teaching at Simmons, the field of negotiation was taking off, right? It was in the 1980s. Getting to Yes had been written, The Art and Science of Negotiation. And the deans of my school asked me to teach negotiation, even though at first I was just teaching about organization behavior. Yeah. And so I started to teach about negotiation. And I had my students write papers about their experiences negotiating as part of their final papers. And I got the most amazing stories that led me into understanding something about gender. Some of the stories were sort of how they used who they were successfully, but a lot of them had really pushback. I remember the story that really stands out for me is this woman who ran a travel agency, and she worked with companies, and she was talking to this guy that managed all the travel for this very large company, and he slams his hand down on the desk, and he says to her, "Look, bitch, you're going to give me a kickback, right?" And, so I then started to think about, what happens when, he probably said that to men too. But I think he thought that since she was a young woman, it was going to be much more powerful, right? And so I then started to use my student papers to start to write the book. The first one I wrote about gender was called The Shadow Negotiation, where I took the ideas, in negotiation, we tend to focus on, what are your interests? What are their interests? What deals do we get? And the shadow negotiation was this idea about relationship building that takes place beneath that. And so I talked about two things. One was advocacy, how you become an effective advocate for yourself, because I found women got in their way a lot and they were expected to take everybody's interests into account, to satisfy everybody. And so they had a challenge with advocacy. They got pushback like this woman, what does she say when he says, look, you're going to give me a kickback? What does she do? Well, what did she do? She said, forget it, and left. Just gave up the business, right? What I call an interruption. So there's advocacy. And then there's what we call connection. How do you start to make the relationship with the other person so that you can do negotiations? So this gender perspective was part of the shadow negotiation. And I remember when the book came out, it was named by Harvard Business Review as one of the best books of the year, that year. And I would go and give talks, and these men would come up to me and they would say, would you sign this for my wife, but it's really for me. And that's when I really understood that when you study women's experiences negotiating, you have insights into negotiation that affect everybody.
Right.
Now, it may affect women more because of what the expectations are, but I think it really gives us a window into negotiation that we hadn't seen before. And then, of course, when I went to the program on negotiation, I like to say I became the instant expert on gender, because I was the only woman. I hadn't really studied gender. I had my student papers, but I hadn't written anything about it. And I became the instant expert on gender, because I always like to say, of course, only women have gender, right? So I must be an expert. And so that's really how I got interested in really studying it. And then I had my students, and then I did a lot of interviews. Stories is the way I work, by trying to talk to women about stories. And that's how I did papers and the book Negotiating at Work also has stories about people negotiating at work.
And that's so helpful to have the stories.
It
so
is.
When you were at the Harvard Research Project on Negotiation, there was like Bill Urey, who we both know and I love. And then, Roger Fisher was alive in that time, who wrote Getting to Yes, and so many more of those.
Howard Rafa.
Right?
Yes, so many of the stars of the field.
Negotiating even with them, weren't you?
I was the only woman. It was really an interesting situation. So I want to tell you two stories about it, because one is a story that was really important to me in terms of my thinking. So I was the associate director. Jeff Rubin, who was the executive director, had brought me in. I was the associate director. I was the only woman in that group. And they were very high-powered men, right? Yeah. Bill Urey, Roger Fisher, Howard Rafa, Larry Susskind, Jeff Rubin.
Right.
And so it was great for me. I really established myself in the negotiation and gender area, but I decided that I didn't want to become the executive director, because I had this big grant back at Simmons with the Ford Foundation, and I just thought it was going to be hard. In the program on negotiation, it was structured. There was a central organization and projects projects were supposed to be self-funded. But, people from the projects kept coming to the executive director and asking for more money, which the project didn't have. And I was thinking, I don't want to spend all my time saying no. So I was going to say, no, I didn't want to be the executive director. And then Howard Rafa, who very famous man, wrote The Art and Science of Negotiation, came into my office and he said, Debbie, we would like you to be the executive director. And I'm about to say no. And he says, do not say no.
So that was a negotiation in itself, right?
Yeah, he gave me the hint. He said, ask yourself at what price you would do this job. Well, I never thought of that before, right? I always think people ask you to do something is either a yes or it's a no. And he didn't mean money. He didn't mean what they were paying me. It was just a formula for that. He meant, what would it take for me to say yes to that? And that interaction has been so important. Howard died 2 years ago, and I had to write something in the negotiation journal. And I was called that my short course with Howard Rafa, because it led me to the idea that anytime anybody asks you to do something, it's always a yes, and here's what I need. And
Right.
the reason I think that works for women is because women are expected often to say yes.
Yeah.
So you say yes, which shows your relational side, but then you say, well, but there's an and.
Yes.
And here's what I need to do it. And maybe you won't get it. So maybe you actually ultimately say no, or maybe
Right.
you do get it. But at least you've entered into a negotiation. And Howard taught me that. He
Yes.
taught me it's not yes or no. He said
And
it's
I
what,
like that you said yes and instead of yes if.
no, not yet,
It's a
because
big
that's,
difference, isn't it?
it's very different. I think, yes, if is a little bit of a negotiation, but yes, and opens it up to mutual gains, right?
Right.
I'll do this. And
Right.
then what do I need in order to make it happen? And
Right.
I use this all the time. It's one of my most important insights. I'm about to write a paper on it, because there's a bunch of women academics who feel that they do too much invisible work. And they want to form something called the Just Say No Club. And I want to tell them, that's not what you want. You want to do yes and.
Yeah.
Because sometimes what they're asking you to do can be really important for your career.
Right.
If you're just going to say, I'm going to say no to all these things, you never discover
Yeah.
it. Anyway, so that's how I got interested in gender, longer than you probably want to hear.
Price. It's like, who's going to help me? What kind
Right.
of support am I going to have?
Do I need resources?
Resources, exactly. And accolades and
accolades. When I teach yes and, so many women have said to me, my tendency always when people ask me to take on something extra is to say no.
Right.
And now I realize with yes and that it's opened up possibilities for me. There was this one attorney, she was a very senior attorney in a large bank. And anytime anybody asked her to do something, she would say no. And she said, the most important thing I took from your course was yes and. The last time they asked me, I said, yes, and I'll take on this project. And she grew her department.
Yeah. No,
And,
it's brilliant.
It's wonderful. It's wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah. And then there's always like Bill Urey wrote The Power of a Positive No. So
Yes.
if you really can't do something, you can always say, well, I can't do this, but I could do this.
Right, but I think that's an and.
Yeah, it's almost like an and, isn't it?
I think, so there's a place that I think no can work differently for men and women.
Yeah.
Because there's an expectation that women will say yes. And often I think women train people in their organizations to expect they will say yes. And so saying no is hard, even if you do it very nicely.
Yeah.
And even if you have an alternative idea about somebody else could do it. I think yes and is more powerful. Because if you know somebody else who can do it, yes, it's really interesting. And I really think that Joan over here would do it better. It's really you show your relational self, but then you also have the negotiation.
You're really there with the other party to give them what they want. It may not be you, but it may be someone else.
Or you might do it with the with what you get to do it.
Right.
Yeah. So that was a big lesson for me.
There are times where you do have to say no, like, can you stay tonight? And you're thinking, oh God, I got to pick up my kid. And
no, there are times.
Yeah,
there are
times. You still can do the power of a positive no.
Well, you can. Yeah,
I can't do this, but you know what? I can do this for you, or I can get Deborah to do it for you.
That's right. I mean, I think that's great. So it's a little bit of no and.
Yeah, no and.
It's a little like no and, right? No, I can't do it, and here's somebody else who could.
Yeah.
Because I think but is a problem. Because but isn't inclusive. So no and, I never thought of it that way, but it's a great insight, no and.
Yeah,
no, I can't say right and.
I love it.
Me too. I'm always yes and. I never had no and. That's a great one.
I mean, there are times you have to do that. So why not?
I totally agree.
I love it. I love it.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the differences in men and women in negotiation. Are there differences, and what are they?
Well, so this is a question that everybody always asks, and people always want to say, yes, there are differences. Women don't negotiate as much as men. And particularly, it's about compensation. They don't negotiate for pay. So they don't negotiate. They say that negotiation is like going to the dentist. I gave you a whole bunch of these things, right? They say it's like negotiating to the dentist. Wait a minute. Sorry, let me get my notes. Don't say that one.
I just
don't ask. They're less likely to start negotiation. They say they're just positively disposed to negotiate, like going to the dentist. They're less confident. They feel they can't do it. They set lower goals. They don't feel a sense of entitlement. They accept less in salary. They're less satisfied with outcomes, and they suffer what I call aspirational collapse.
Wow.
Somebody says, you know, aspirations collapse. Yes, I'll do it. No, I can't possibly do it. Right. So my problem with that is that the research does not support this. All the research, primarily where people talk about these gender differences, I'm just writing a paper about it. For the last 40 years, we've talked about men and women negotiate differently. And most of the work comes from studies of compensation. And you know where those studies are done? 90% of them are done in a laboratory where you have a buyer and a seller. And of those, so most of the experiments, most of the study of gender is done in a laboratory, buyers and sellers, and with people who don't know each other, they're negotiating one issue. And the reason that we say women don't negotiate is because of women don't ask, because of those kinds of studies. Yeah. I think that it isn't true.
Yeah,
you know,
it's a very narrow study. Yeah.
They're very narrow studies, but you know, when people want to get published, that's what they do. And, you know, over the last several years, you know, the Lean In organization and McKinsey have been looking at these studies of men and women in companies about negotiating for money and negotiating for compensation, and they actually find no difference in the willingness of women to ask. They find that sometimes men get more because they don't have to negotiate as frequently, but women ask just as frequently, and we tend not to want to accept those. We still tend to focus on the fact that women don't ask. And so, you know, then there's also, if you look at some of the big analyses, I have to consult my notes because I'm trying to give you the research because I assumed you wanted some of that.
That's fine.
Women tend to be slightly more cooperative than men, but that's because there's an expectation that we will be more cooperative, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we concede. We can still have a yes and, right?
Right, and what's wrong with being collaborative and cooperative and still watching boundaries, right?
Exactly.
I mean, that's the thing. People think, well, you know, he's not going to like me or she's not going to like me.
Right.
I give her a hard time on that. But you could be very, very nice and give a hard time and say, gee, you know, I really can't do that.
Yeah. You know, how you say something is as important as what you say.
Oh,
that's what I always say. That there is some research that suggests that women are more ethical. Now, in these kinds of laboratory studies, they look at things like ethics, and for the most part, you know, because they're only negotiating about one issue. Remember,
right?
So you know what that kind of negotiation is like, right? It's very distributive, very competitive.
Right.
Women tend to be somewhat more ethical, and so in that sense, they might be seen as not getting as much as they could. But I think you know, we need to get over the idea that men and women negotiate differently. I think it's not true. Now, I'm guessing you have experience though, because you work with people in family situations and law situations, and your observations may be different than mine from the study in the literature and also in organizations.
Well, don't you think it also depends on the person? There are some women who are assertive, like you and me, okay?
Yeah.
Are willing to negotiate. I do it, you know, I always say I'm the dolphin attorney, gentle, yet very powerful.
Right.
And so I will watch boundaries. I will ask. I will confront gently.
Right. But that's not in your hormones.
No,
right?
I don't think it's in my hormones, but I think, and there are men that are meek and are afraid to say what they mean.
Right.
So I think it is a lot individual, but I think as a culture, women are called bitches, right? Like you.
Well, so that's different. So now there's this thing about the social cost of asking.
Yeah. So I think socially, sometimes we are under pressure to negotiate differently.
Yes, I think that's true. I think that but what negotiating differently often means the pressure is people expect you to say yes. And if you don't say yes, you're a bitch, right? That is
acquiesce, yeah. Or just
acquiesce, the same thing. You're supposed to do it. And if you violate that expectation, but you know, I think that one of the things that I think women are very good at, you know, I don't like to do this essentialist kind of thinking, but one of the things I think women are very good at many women are very good at reading situations and knowing when and where they're supposed to do things. I think it's because of, you know, how we've been brought up as daughters. how we've been mothers, how we've been wives, how we've been girlfriends, how we've been at school. I think that the expectations teaches women often, not as a biological trait, but from experience, to pay attention to what the context is in which they're going to negotiate. But there's this other part which you bring up, which is the social cost of asking.
Yes, yes.
So again, the research, the experiments say that often women who ask are often penalized, right? Because they are being bitches, they are being too tough. And and the advice that's usually given, which I don't like, the advice is usually, to sort of tone it down, or to say something like, my boss suggested that I ask you for this.
That's a cop out.
That is a real cop out. And I think that what I like to say is, if you can give good reasons for what you're doing, connect it. Why are you asking? Why is it good for your group? Why is it good for your organization? Why is it good for your family? Those kinds of things can be very compelling, and you don't have to, and I think they get you out of the double bind. The double bind is be assertive, but be nice, right? And I think these kinds of ways that you focus on the reasons behind, and also talk about why you're passionate. The research says if you say you're passionate about something, people are less critical.
Right.
I'm really passionate.
What do you say? I strongly believe this.
Exactly. Same thing. I think that's exactly the same thing. You give an account of why you're doing something.
Yes.
So I think these sort of basic differences between men and women don't really hold up. But I do think that we need to understand a little bit about how to negotiate for ourselves. And I think we learn that. It's just a question of sort of building it into your repertoire.
And being genuine. I think another thing is when women try to emulate the man's approach that is maybe aggressive rather than assertive.
Right.
I think then they're disingenuous, and people can feel that. Men and women can feel when.
Well, they might not be disingenuous. They may be a tough person. But,
true. If you really are a tough person.
If you're a tough person, that's the kind of thing that you might do. But then you have to, then you need an account. You need to say, I know this, I'm pretty tough. When I negotiate, I'm really tough. Let me tell you about that. And so then you've diffused any kind of way that people are going to sort of hold it against you. I mean, sort of, understanding who you are.
Although I would have to say I have a new mediation where the wife is comes across extremely tough, and she's alienated her kids, and she's alienated her spouse,
That's a problem.
Alienated her boss, and alienated people. So I think sometimes if we say we're tough, sometimes we have to think about, okay, is it serving me?
That's right. Right.
Maybe
that's a person.
New tools that, I mean, for me, I am a strong negotiator. I wouldn't say I'm a tough one, but I'm a strong one. People go, oh no, Mari's going to negotiate.
Right.
But it's much more, I'm relentless,
right.
But I'm not aggressive.
Well, I think this woman sounds like, she's not understanding how she's undermining herself.
Right.
My husband is a psychoanalyst. Okay. And he always says, when people have problems, I always say, go get a therapist. And sometimes, this woman, it sounds like she doesn't have that sense of how she comes across.
No.
That she's alienated her children. Well, that's really tough.
I had a caucus with her, as a matter of fact, and I said,
to talk to her,
I want to help you to get what you want. I want to help you, and if you don't see what you're doing, that's hurting you.
Right.
Impeding your progress of what you want.
Right.
And so
I tell people that you can't get what you want if you don't know what you want. And it sounds like she's not very clear. She's just hurt.
She's clear what she wants, but she is so aggressive that she's turning other people around her off. Yeah. So, I mean, that's why when you say tough, the connotation I have is you can be strong, but being tough sounds like my way or the highway, which is what I'm experiencing with this particular.
I would say my way, the highway is not a negotiation.
No.
Right. It's trying to assert power that you don't necessarily have. My way, the highway, don't get far in a negotiation like that, people say, well, goodbye, like,
Right.
we're not going to negotiate. So I think that's, yeah.
But in this era of Me Too, Deborah,
Yeah.
and I wanted to, so if you're just listening, tuned in, I am so excited to be talking with Deborah Kolb. She is amazing, amazing gender negotiation. And this is her newest book. It's called Negotiating at Work, Turn Small Wins into Big Gains. And she is an expert on gender negotiations.
Yeah. So Me Too. Yeah, well, Me Too is really interesting. I sent you that article that I wrote for the Negotiation Journal about women negotiating in the time of Trump.
Right.
The first part is that he has a style that's very masculine. The second is about what we've been talking about, how a woman's place at the table there. But the third thing is about,
and there aren't very many women at the table.
That's part of the problem, isn't it? Yes. But then there's this issue of what Me Too has come out in the same era. And, it's a really mixed bag. On the one hand, we really see that as empowered women to say things that they have met. I mean, you're just sort of amazed at what has happened in some of these organizations about the treatment of women, and they never felt empowered to do it. So I think Me Too has had a very empowering effect, but it's had a downside too that we have to worry about, which is that men, some of the research is now suggesting that men are worried. They don't want to be in an office alone with a woman. They don't want to go out, they want to be the Mike Pence rule, only have dinner with your wife, or they don't want to sponsor them. And, that is, I don't see that. You may disagree with me. I don't see that as a negotiation issue between the man and the woman. I think it's an organizational issue.
Yes.
How people deal with this. But I think it's a real serious issue. But then, of course, we have these new wonderful women taking on leadership roles like Nancy Pelosi and all these women that were elected to office and are really sort of speaking up about women's issues.
Yes. Wow, would you believe? Oh my goodness.
We're done?
You hear that? We are just out of time.
Okay.
I could talk to you for ages.
Let's try to figure out what we can do together, right? Let's try to figure it out. So let's send each other some emails about, do you want to try to give a little course online together?
Yes,
let's try to figure it out.
We have to do that. We have to do that.
I love talking to you. You're the best.
Yes. So we will talk after we end the show here. I just want to say again, Deborah Kolb is amazing. She is an expert on gender negotiations, women in negotiation. This is her newest book, Negotiating at Work, Turn Small Wins into Big Gains. And I'm just so thrilled that you are joining us again. So we will have you back again soon.
I hope so. My pleasure.
We'll get together because I know it's so important for our audience to hear, both men and women, to hear all the wisdom that you can share.
Well, but I also think we negotiated with each other, which is also interesting to women. Right.
Yes. And so I want you, Deborah, to give your website, and it's time to go.
Right. DeborahMKolb.com.
Okay. And that's Deborah.
Right.
Kolb.com.
It's called KOLB.
KOLB. Thank you.
Thank you, Mari.